Thank you for inviting me, Lucian. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me. It's good to see friends. Glad to be with you, virtually speaking. I thought I'd read some poems, and then I hope we'll have a kind of conversation about poetry, which I'm very much looking forward to. I thought I'd start with a kind of prayer or ode to poetry. Don't desert me just because I stayed up last night watching The Lost Weekend. I know I've spent too much time praising your naked body to strangers and gossiping about lovers you betrayed. I've stalked you in foreign cities and followed your far-flung movements, pretending I could describe you. Forgive me for getting jacked on coffee and obsessing over your features year after jittery year. I'm sorry for handing you a line and typing you on a screen, but don't let me suffer in silence. Does anyone still invoke the muse, string a wooden lyre for Apollo, or try to saddle up Pegasus? Winged horse, heavenly god or goddess, indifferent entity, secret code, stored magic, pleasance and half wonder. Hell, I've loved you my entire life without even knowing what you are or how. Please help me to find you. There's always something unconscious in the writing of poetry. In his tremendous defense of poetry, Shelley says that not even the greatest poet can say, I will write poetry, because poetry's never entirely at the dispensation of the will. So it's kind of an invocation to the unconscious, hymn to the unknown, all the different names people have for the muse. Cotton candy. We walked on the bridge over the Chicago River for what turned out to be the last time, and I ate cotton candy, that sugary air, that sweet blue light spun out of nothingness. It was just a moment, really, nothing more. But I remember marveling at the sturdy cables of the bridge that held us up, and threading my fingers the long and slender fingers of my grandfather, an old man from the old world who long ago disappeared into the nether regions. And I remember that 8-year-old boy who had tasted the sweetness of air, which still clings to my mouth and disappears when I breathe. Self-portrait. I live between my heart and my head, like a married couple who can't get along. I live between my left arm, which is swift and sinister, and my right, which is righteous. I live between a laugh and a scowl, and voted against myself, a two-party system. My left leg dawdled or danced along, my right cleaved to the straight and narrow. My left shoulder was like a stripper on vacation. My right stood upright as a Roman soldier. Let's just say that my left side was the organ donor and leave my private parts alone. But as for my eyes, which are 2 shades of brown, well, Dionysus meet Apollo. Look at Eve raising her left eyebrow while Adam puts his right foot down. No one expected to survive, but divorce seemed out of the question. I suppose my left hand and my right hand will be clasped over my chest in the coffin, and I'll be reconciled at last. I'll be whole again. There were some terrifically gifted kids in Austin, Texas, who who had a poetry series where they animated the poems. And I went to the showing of it. They were showing it in New York, what they were going to do. It was a whole season, and they did self-portrait, and they showed self-portrait on a screen, and then they animated it. And I was totally with it until the end, when they had a photo of me and my arms were folded and I was in a coffin. And then I didn't feel that great. Then I didn't feel that great about it. Then I didn't feel that great about it. It was really unnerving. This is called Troubadour Song. This poem has a tremendous secret meaning to me. It comes up. I'm going to read you after this. I'm going to read you some poems from my book for Gabriel. And the night I was working on this poem, I'd been working on it a long time, but I was finishing this poem on the night that Gabriel disappeared. And so it was spooky to me. I didn't know what was happening, but I was working on this. Troubadour Song. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and hummed a song for nothing. How nothing came to me. I dreamed I mounted a horse along an empty beach where we galloped far away till I was out of reach. We trotted past the lighthouse abandoned on the dunes and paused by a small stable that was now in ruins. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and made a song for nothing. How nothing came to me. We rode to the starkest edge of nowhere by the sea. The horse was all that remained of what I'd longed to be. We had somewhere deep to rest and nothing left to see. And so the two of us walked into the cemetery. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and sang a song for nothing. How nothing came to me.
Mm.
Wow.
Mm. Mm.
Wow.
Super spooky.
Mm.
So I'm just going to read you a few poems from my book-length poem for Gabriel. It's all a single thing, but this will give you the feel for what it's like. He once cut the grass around Emily Dickinson's grave in the West Cemetery in downtown Amherst and read me the inscription, "Called Back." It reminded him of going to the cemetery in Houston to visit his friend who was now in heaven, Letty said. He experienced the rapture, but Gabriel talked to the gravestone and clutched a reindeer with a yellow bandana. I wonder if he knelt down and prayed with the family when his friend died of leukemia. Cousins rolled in the aisle speaking in tongues. Jews stand up to the Almighty, I told him, but mostly we just skipped out of services and headed to the playground. He was named after Janet's mother, Gertrude, and the angel Gabriel, strong man of God. He had 3 epileptic seizures. Suddenly his brain caught fire. He spasmed to the ground and blanked out. Dostoevsky believed the convulsive fits bring you down, bring you closer. The idiot, the holy fool are nearer to God. He was a pallbearer at 2 funerals. One of my fathers died in Chicago, one in Phoenix. I gave both eulogies. The music of death is solemn. He kept hugging me afterward and talked like a madman in the car to the graveyard. The population of his feelings could not be governed by the authorities. He had reasons why reason disobeyed him and voted him out of office. Anxiety, his constant companion, made it difficult to rest. Unruly party of one, Forget about truces or compromises. The barricades will be stormed. Every day was an emergency. Every day called for another emergency meeting of the cabinet. In his country, there were scenes of spectacular carnage. Hurricanes welcomed him. He adored typhoons and tornadoes, furies unleashed, houses lifted up and carried to the sea, uncontained, uncontainable. Unbolt the doors, fling open the gates. Here he comes, chaotic wind of the gods. He was trouble, but he was our trouble.
Hmm.
Oh, that's so.
There's a sub-motif in my book, a kind of chorus of poets who lost children and poets as parents. Everyone excluded here, but the news about poets as parents historically is not good. Just saying. So this is a section. Rainer Maria Rilke sacrificed everything for his art. He dedicated himself to the great work. I admired his single-mindedness all through my 20s. I argued his case. Now I think he was a jerk for skipping his daughter's wedding for fear of losing his focus. He believed in the ancient enmity between daily life and the highest work, or Ruth and the Dueno elegies. It's probably a middle-class prejudice of mine to think that Anna Akhmatova should have raised her son Lev instead of dumping him on her husband's mom. Motherhood is a bright torture, she confessed. I was not worthy of it. Lev never considered it sufficient for her to stand outside his prison month after month, clutching packages and composing requiem for the masses. I argued with Rilke and Akhmatova all the years I shuttled Gabriel to school and then locked down with their poems. I argued with them while I scribbled away in the pizza joints and video arcades. It is a true error to marry with poets, John Berryman concluded, or to be by them. Mr. Impulsive walked out of class when he did not like what the teacher said. It was boring. Mr. Impulsive scurried out in a storm wearing shorts and a wife beater. Soon he was shivering. The neighbors complained to the landlord, complained to me, but Mr. Impulsive could not be bothered to close the gate. Mr. Impulsive left the house without his keys. I don't know how many times he camped out on the front stoop. One night he convinced a neighbor to shimmy the lock with a credit card. He was never locked out again. Mr. Impulsive will not be sleeping at home. He'd rather stay out and crash wherever he finds himself at 5 a.m. He could be oddly well-mannered to the parents of his friends. He was usually welcome. From the notebook of Mr. Impulsive, it is better to sneak through a side door than to wait in line like a sucker. It is not necessary to get directions. It's much better to head out right now. Time doesn't matter. These were the antics of Mr. Impulsive, who never knew where he was going until he got there. From the storybook of bluster and bad judgment, from the annals of loneliness, from the history of kids he met on the street in special programs, it was dangerous to stay in Amherst. Lord of misadventure, I'm scared of rounding him up and turning him into a story. God of scribbles and erasures, I hope he shines through like a Giacometti portrait. I keep scraping the canvas and painting him over again, but he keeps slipping away. He was like a spider preyed on by other spiders and older insects. Sweet venom, his arrivals were swift and his departures sudden. I couldn't understand how he lifted the shower door right off its hinges. When Gabriel cooked, the flames rose too high and the fire alarm sounded. When the fire alarm sounded, he tore it off the wall and left the wires dangling. We took him to Arlington Park Racetrack. They wouldn't let him in the clubhouse because he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He disappeared. And in 10 minutes, he came back wearing a button-down shirt, a tie, and a blue blazer. He stopped by with a dozen incense candles. You don't even like incense, Lori said. It didn't matter. He had gotten them for free. He bought 10 cheeseburgers for $10 on the dollar menu at McDonald's and threw 6 of them away. He brought a six-pack of beer into the common room of the nursing home to watch a football game with my mother, because everyone needs a good beer, especially the guy on the ventilator and the nurses who work too hard. He said the countryside made him feel nervous. He wanted a 24-hour kind of city. He woke me up at 2 a.m. to take a walk. He needed to talk. Lori pulled me back into bed. He had flat feet and an awkward gait. He didn't like to dance. He liked to go to raves and chill with friends. He couldn't pay attention, but his meds made him feel sleepy, and he sold them to college kids. 2 more. He liked to kick back and remember the time we were riding home in a taxi cab on the West Side Highway, and my mother offered to take him to a strip club for his 21st birthday. What's wrong with that, she wanted to know. Why couldn't they celebrate together? That's just what you want, he bellowed, going for a lap dance with grandma. He liked to kick back and declare he wanted to track down his birth mother to see if he really had Celtic blood. He liked to kick back and tell my family about the time he saw an American Hasidic Jewish reggae musician at Hampshire College. He saw Nicolas Cage going up an escalator in a movie theater and turned to his friends. I hate Nicolas Cage. He has such a big head. He liked to kick back and tell us how much he liked weed and shrooms. How bad could it be for you, he said. It comes out of the ground. He liked to kick back and roll a spliff with his friends at night. He always liked to go higher and higher. We're here, he'd say, lifting his hand to the middle of his chest. And we need to go here, he continued on, and raised his hand up to his neck. I did not know the work of mourning is like carrying a bag of cement up a mountain at night. The mountaintop is not in sight because there is no mountaintop. Poor Sisyphus grief. I did not know I would struggle through a ragged underbrush without an upward path because there is no path. There's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into, and time with its medieval chambers, time with its jagged edges and blunt instruments. I did not know the work of mourning is a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves, though sometimes when I sleep, I'm with him again, and then I wake. Poor Sisyphus grief. I'm not ready for your heaviness cemented to my body. Look closely, and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day. Then I'm just going to read you a couple of poems from Stranger by Night. This is a 4-line poem that I adapted from the Greek. It's a beautiful little thing. It's a poem called Epitaph. It's just called Epitaph, but it was by Nikonitos, who was only known by this poem from the 3rd century BCE. So I called it Epitaph by Nikonitos. Traveler, I am the grave of Biton. If you go from Tyrone to Amphipolis, give Nicarachus this message. His only son died in a storm in early winter before sunrise. My friends don't get buried. My friends don't get buried in cemeteries anymore. Their wives can't stand the sadness of funerals, the spectacle of wreaths and prayers, tear-soaked speeches delivered from the altar, all those lies and encomiums, the suffocating smell of flowers filling everything. No more undertakers in black suits clutching handkerchiefs, old buddies weeping in corners, telling off-color stories, nipping shots. No more covered mirrors, black dresses, skull caps, and crucifixes. Sometimes it takes me a year or two to get out to the backyard in Sheffield or Fresno. Those tall ashes scattered under a tree somewhere in a park, somewhere in New Jersey. I am a delinquent mourner stepping on pine cones, forgetting to pray. But the mourning goes on anyway, because my friends keep dying without a schedule, without even a funeral, while the silence drums us from the other side. The suffocating smell of flowers fills everything, always. The darkness grows warmer, then colder. I just have to lie down on the grass and press my mouth to the earth to call them so they would answer. The black dress. I don't know why I opened her book almost randomly on a whim. It signaled me from the shelf after all these years, like a burning black dress tangled in the branches. Her dress. She was the one who was burning. And that's when the letter fell out. A love letter, sort of, after we'd given up on each other. Or did we? Our impossibility. And suddenly it came back to me in a rush. That night in Boston, a restaurant on the harbor, a storm simmering outside, that slinky black dress she was wearing. I didn't know she was burning inside of it. I thought it was the coming storm, summer lightning. I didn't know I was turning the pages of her book, her body, which I would read so closely. I wanted it so desperately. She was the fire. I didn't know she was already mourning for her childhood in the orchard, her lost self. Forgive me. I didn't know she was burning when she took off that black dress. There's a poet named Daniel Hughes in this poem who was a friend of mine who had an indomitable spirit. He was a Shelley scholar, and he had a terrible case of MS. This remembers him. It's called The Radiance, Detroit, 1984. Late September in the shade outside of State Hall, that concrete brutality where my students are smoking off a hangover and gossiping in Ukrainian, while Dan Hughes leans on his walker and talks to me about Shelley's bright destructions. I did not know it was indelible. the sun spangling the campus trees, the traffic thickening the smog outside the museum on Woodward, our voices rising. When you tell the story of those years going up in flames, don't forget the radiance of that day in autumn, burning out of time. Days of 1975. As I've been coming to the end of my teaching life, I've been thinking more and more about the beginning of my teaching life and how I started. And this is a poem about that, when I taught in Pennsylvania poets in the schools. It started with the tattered blue secret of Basho, that windswept spirit riding my back pocket for luck. It started with a walk through the woods at dawn, mud on my new shoes, high humming in the trees. I was not prepared for the scent of freshly turned soil to pervade the empty classroom, or the morning to commence with a bell that did not stop ringing in my head. So many expectations filed noisily into the room. I was ready to begin. From the tall windows, I could see a storefront church opening on the other side of the polluted river. I remember walking past the rows and rows of bent heads, scarred desks, and gazing up at the endless mountains. In those hopeful days of 1975, I drove the country roads in honor of radiance. O spirit of poetry, souls of those I have loved, come back to teach me again. To my 17-year-old self, your friends are sniffing glue from a paper bag in the back of an Impala, tooling around Niles and Morton Grove, looking for something to escape whatever boredom or childhood damage everyone suffers. But don't get high with them in a sputtering car that your girlfriend refuses to enter. Don't lie to her after she moves away and lie down with her friend. Don't sob in the locker room after the game, or lose your mind from repeated blows to the head on the football field at Niles West High School. I mean, whatever locker you hit or don't hit in desperation, born of the suburbs, just stand and wait for the unexpected night when poetry climbs through the unlocked window in the basement of the split-level house on Sherwin Avenue and sits down at your desk. This is called the Guild. This is for us here. You spend your life going over poems with your friends, and some of those friends are older, and then you start realizing that they're all dying on you or have died on you. The Guild. Goodbye to the years we spent leaning over badly typed poems in cramped studies in dank hotel rooms, half crazed, inconsolable, constantly jabbing pencils at each other, brooding, smoking on the balcony across from a temple on the other side of the river one night in Rome, loyal or disloyal to the old gods, our flawed mentors, our weakness for standing at the podium seeking applause, slashing lines, reciting Blake or Yeats, giving up sleep for late night sessions, listening to Coltrane, and gossiping about new books and poets who've been dead for centuries, facing each other knee to knee or sitting side by side over each fresh draft, furiously arguing about this enjambment or that illusion, mysteries of the craft, the muse, our shoulders touching, our voices growing hoarse with laughter, or walking out to the pier a few yards from the sea so that we could stand there together under the stars, alone with the abyss. Stranger by night. After I lost my peripheral vision, I started getting sideswiped by pedestrians cutting in front of me, almost randomly, like memories I couldn't see coming as I left the building at twilight, or stepped gingerly off the curb, or even just crossed the wet pavement to the stairs descending precipitously into the subway station. And I apologized to every one of those strangers jostling me in a world that had grown stranger by night. I'm just going to read two more poems. A baker swept by. You were already losing your eyesight last winter in Rome when you paused in the doorway at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and a baker swept by on a shiny bicycle, waving a cap and singing under his breath. You didn't know bakers wore white aprons dusted with flour and floated around the city like angels on a freshly baked day. You weren't sure why morning halted up and down the street as you stood in the doorway and a baker winged by on a weekend morning, so new and pristine that you looked into the sky, and for one undiminished instant of misplaced time, you saw brightness, brightness everywhere, before a shadow crossed the rooftops and it was blotted out. I was never able to pray. Wheel me down to the shore where the lighthouse was abandoned and the moon tolls in the rafters. Let me hear the wind paging through the trees and see the stars flaring out one by one like the forgotten faces of the dead. I was never able to pray, but let me inscribe my name in the book of waves and then stare into the dome of a sky that never ends and see my voice sail into the night. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
That's really.
Yeah, that really cheered me up.
as I've been doing for so long.
I want to
Hey.
hear. I want to hear. I'm sorry. I want to hear the line about Giacometti, and used in a poem about Gabriel, and it was about it evoked Giacometti's painting process. Ed, do you remember the line? Can you repeat it? It was so great.
God of scribbles and erasures.
I think so. Yeah.
I'd have to look it up exactly. It's about scraping the canvas.
Hey, you got any of those pages from the memoir, man?
I don't have them on me, but I remember some of them. I'd have to look it up. Why? You want me to read some of them?
Yeah, I'm gonna feel like a downer. I mean, you're so cheerful. I want to see your other side.
Okay. I've been writing a book called My Childhood in Pieces. And a lot of them are, Garrett knows this. He's lived through a lot of it and helped me with them. And a lot of them are structured as like stand-up jokes. But I don't really have the manuscript in front of me, but I remember some of them. Will that work, Garrett?
I'll help you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll fix it after you mess it up.
I can ask everyone the advice of my version and then your revision. That'll be good. Here's the prologue. It's not written in lines, it's written in tiny 2 and 3 sentences. My grandparents taught me to write my sins on paper and cast them into the water during the first day of the new year. They didn't anticipate an entire book. Then Garrett thinks the second line should be, my grandparents taught me to write my sins on paper and cast them into the water during the first day of the new year. An entire book they did not anticipate. So it's the same thing, it just reverses the sentence. Any votes?
I like Ed, I like your version better. No offense, Garrett.
Very Jewish.
I like my third version. An entire
What's that?
book I did not expect.
Second.
What?
My
I
husband,
don't anticipate. I like expect.
Oh, expect.
my
So you
husband just,
voted me out.
my husband just joined me because he heard you from the kitchen. He heard your words and he was so enticed. He's here with
Okay.
me. And he said he liked the second version because it's so Jewish. He
Yeah,
also wants to know if you're from Chicago, because I think you lived a few blocks from his brother.
Ah,
Here's Herb.
Yes, I'm from Chicago. Where is his brother?
Well, he's passed away
yes,
now.
he's
but-
passed away, but he lived in Niles.
Yeah, well, my family, when I was in high school, moved to Skokie.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So that was next door to Niles.
Yeah.
Well, after you read, someone said that really cheered me up and everyone laughed. But I feel like listening to you has cheered me up because it's been a really rough week. And your poetry is healing in the way that poetry can heal us during hard times.
True.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
It's
I decided to
it-
write. Yeah, go ahead.
It's heartbreaking. I read your poem about Gabriel, your book about Gabriel, and it's just heartbreaking, but it's so beautiful and it's just so moving. I can't express it in words.
Thank you. It's very sad. But Garrett is just reminding me and reminding everyone that I've been writing this memoir, which is kind of a comedy about my childhood, and that it's turning everything into seeing it in a different light. I got the idea when the first one I wrote it's a memoir, so you always know how old I am. But I was about 8, and my mother was this is the very first one of these I wrote. My mother was standing at the stove stirring a can of soup. And I said, you really shouldn't make fun of me. You're my mother. And she said, don't be so sure, kid. So
Dark humor.
that's what it is. That's the whole thing. The very first piece in the book is called All Sales Are Final. God is a lot like my old boss on Maxwell Street, my grandfather said. You may get home and discover that your new shirt doesn't have a back, but you're still not going to get a refund.
Mishpacha.
Yeah, it's like that. It goes all the way through. I thought this was good. My parents' names were Ruby and Irma, and this is called April Fool's Day. No joke. Irma and Ruby thought they were ready to have a child. The joke was on them. It was also on me. Can you have a joke played on you before you're born? Can you have a practical joke played on you before you're conceived? So, yeah, they were not ready. Let's just say they were not ready. So, anyway, that's kind of how it goes from before I was born and my grandparents to my parents to my sister and me.
this memoir, how far will it go in your life? Will it come up to the present, or does it end at an earlier time in your life?
Right now it ends at 18.
Oh,
I'm gonna do, I'll probably do a sequel of picking it up from there, but it ends when I go to college. Because what I discovered is when I was writing about, I was writing the same style about poets and poetry and my teachers from graduate school who I really love. And in the same style, it turns out you need a little more background information about them. You need a little more context for the academy to get the jokes, especially in poetry. They can feel like inside baseball. But where I grew up, you don't need any you don't need any inside information for what they were for what it was like. So I decided to break it off into two different books. So I've been noodling with the first one, but it ends when I go to college.
hmm.
My grandmother saying it ends. One of the last ones is my grandmother and I playing cards, and she says, I'm worried about you going to college. You don't have good judgment.
Oh,
And I go, well, you taught me very well, Graham. She goes, I don't think so. I want you to promise me that you won't ride on a motorcycle.
she
So
loved you.
I,
Your Graham really loved you because,
oh yeah, she,
motorcycles, she wanted you to
yeah,
live long enough
yeah.
to write all those poems.
She wanted me to make two promises. One, don't ride on a motorcycle. And two, don't become an atheist. It's a bad bet. But I couldn't promise. I couldn't promise. But my grandmother kind of made up Pascal's wager. She she kind of thought being an atheist was a bad gamble. But I couldn't promise on that. I couldn't promise on that one.
How about the motorcycle? Did you,
Oh yeah, I didn't I followed that one. I
good.
didn't ride on a motorcycle.
Um, I have a question about your poems about your son. You had so many incredible details and memories of him. I'm just wondering whether those came to you as you were writing, or did you have a journal that you looked back to?
Um, after after Gabriel died, I tried to go back to work and I couldn't function. So I moved down, I took a leave of absence from my job and I moved down to Atlanta and lived with my partner, Lori. But then I was down there and I didn't know what to do every day. I mean, I've always worked. I didn't know what to do. So I started going to a coffee shop every day and writing a biography of Gabriel. Like it was all a blur, like what had happened, like all the schools he'd gone to, all the medications, everything. I couldn't keep it straight. So I decided for my own sake to write it down, a prose thing. And I spoke to my ex-wife every day. I spoke to my sisters. My mother was still alive. I talked to her. I talked to Gabriel's friends. I tried to put it in some kind of order, but I left myself out of it. And at the end of like 4 months, I had a 150-page document, basically a prose biography of Gabriel. And I showed it to Lori, and she said, well, I don't know what you're asking me, but if you're asking me if this is a book, it's not. It's a document. You've left yourself entirely out of it. But maybe it'll be a good idea to write some poems out of the document. So I went back to New York. I stopped doing any poetry events for 6 or 8 months. I had my job, but I wasn't doing anything. So I still had suddenly I had all my evenings. And I started writing some poems about using the document. The first one I tried to write was the feeling of, you know how when you have a young child, you carry your child on your shoulders. And then there's the last time you do that. There's a certain point where they get to be too old and you don't do that anymore. I was trying to write about that. And I wrote another poem too, and suddenly I was filled with disgust. Like the idea of writing some poems about Gabriel and then mixing it with the other poems struck me as wrong. Even though I've always written books, as most of us do, that have, collections of different kinds of poems, and some were elegies. Like, I didn't have a problem having an elegy for my father in the same book as a love poem. It just didn't faze me to do that. But this suddenly seemed wrong. And so I decided to see if I could go all out. And I hit upon a form. I realized that instead of making Gabriel sound like poetry, I needed to change my style so the poetry sounded like Gabriel, and to accommodate the way that Gabriel was, which was a different kind of information. I had my documents, so I had all the memories written down and the facts, but it didn't have any life to it. And I decided I'd try and write a father's book where I was in it. It wouldn't be Gabriel's story from Gabriel's point of view or from his mother's point of view, but from mine, but it would tell the story. And then I had to make a decision. I had to make a lot of decisions. It was consoling me to think about the format, the lack of punctuation, the sections, all of that. But I had to make a decision about whether I could be ruthless enough to do it. The history of poetry is filled with sentimental poems about lost children, and they're not good poems. So in the 19th century, it was extremely common for people to lose children, and I just didn't want to write a sentimental poem. I didn't see the point of that. But you had to decide whether you could tell the truth or not, and you were willing to. And so I decided I could. And I did. And then the only other thing I'd say about it is the whole time I was trying to tell the story and honor our grief, I was also aware that I'm not the only person that this ever happened to. And I didn't know how to acknowledge that. And then I got the idea. I started thinking of all the poets who'd lost children and what they'd done, like Ben Jonson's poem, Issa's poems, beautiful poems in his hybrid book of prose and poetry. There are a lot of poems. Mallarmé's Tomb for Anatole. I didn't look up anything else. I just started thinking about poets who lost children, and then poets as parents, and that helped me. It created a kind of chorus of grief around it that I couldn't write about all the people who'd lost children, but I could call on our people to see how they handled it and what they did, and that amplified the book, and I felt I was on my way. So that's how it worked, Gail.
Mhm.
So, Edward, I know that of anyone that I've become aware of living in our time, you are an embodiment of something that Wallace Stevens described when he said that poetry is the scholar's art. And I've been reading your incredible book, The Demon and the Angel, which I recommend to all of our poetry junkies, and finding immense resources in it and reflections. So what I'm going to do is give a couple of quotes about poetry that I found to be powerful and relevant. One of the things I call a poem is a soul fossil. It's kind of, they're kind of soul fossils. So the first quote about poetry that I love and like to share is from Leonard Cohen. Poetry is just the evidence of life. If your life is burning well, poetry is just the ash. And a little bit connected to that is from Mayakovsky, writing poetry is like mining for radium. For every gram you work a year, yet how incendiary the burning of those words compared with the smoldering of the raw material. And I'm going to go ahead and throw in two of my own definitions of poetry, and then I'm going to call upon you, Ed, to give us two quotes about poetry and by others, and then two quotes about poetry that are your own. So the first one of mine is a little bit whimsical. I was at a party in Prague and somebody said, "Oh, you write poetry. Why you do that?" And I said, "Poetry is like cocaine." And somebody in the back of the room was like, "Really? Where is it?" You know, they were kind of falling asleep. I said, "Poetry is like cocaine. You do it in lines. It gets you high. And if you do the good stuff, you'll be addicted for life." And the other definition is a little bit whimsical in another way, but it's a little more serious too. A poem is a brainbow, not a rainbow. A poem is a brainbow when the rain of feelings is pierced by the sunlight of intellect. So Ed, now your two quotes from others and two of your own, please. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say that in a poet's glossary, under the definition of poetry, I have a long list of things that poets have said historically about what poetry is. It's a compilation, like the one that's in my poem to poetry. Robert Graves called it. I just cite these. There's a stanza where I cite these. Robert Graves called poetry stored magic. What he meant by that is that it goes around sometimes for centuries stored up. No one knows what the magic is until it's released, and it's released by a reader. I like the 15th century definition, pleasance and half wonder. But the truth is that all definitions of poetry are inaccurate. And the reason for that is that you cannot technically nail it down. As soon as someone comes along and says poetry is something that's written in lines, Charles Baudelaire comes along and says, well, I'm going to write poetry, but it's not going to be in lines, it's going to be in prose. As soon as someone says poetry is fiction, someone else comes along and shows that it can be documentary. I'm not as interested myself in definitions of poetry because definitions are completely objection. I mean, you do need to try and pin it down as opposed to something else. But if you want to get too legalistic about it, you can always sort of blow a hole through it. And it's in this spirit that, Emily Dickinson would say poetry takes the top of my head off. I know it by contact. She knows when she recognizes it, when she experiences it, but she doesn't say, for example, poetry is written in meter. She doesn't give definitions by something intrinsic to poetry. She does it by contact. I think it might be helpful in thinking about this topic in a meaningful way to distinguish poetry from philosophy and as a way of thinking. And if you think of philosophy as logical thinking, then, or one kind of philosophy, because there are certainly philosophers who are more like poets, poets have continually pointed to a kind of non-sequential or associative thinking that distinguishes it from philosophy. Keats called it non-consecutive reasoning. And so non-consecutive reasoning is distinct from philosophy, which tends to be consecutive thinking. Now, this non-consecutive or associative way of thinking is a way of tapping into something that's not entirely reasonable or irrational or unconscious, whatever you want to call it. You could call it the unconscious, as Freud does, or you call it the collective unconscious, as Jung does, or you can call it the muse, as the ancient poets did, or you can treat it as the romantic poets did, which is the muse that's actually not external to you, but something that's inside of you that you release. There are a lot of different names for this force or spirit of what people are trying to describe, but it all points to something the same, which is that it cannot be controlled. It's something uncontainable. Plato was onto something when he wanted to banish the poets from the Republic. Not that I agree with that, but the reason he wanted to banish them was because they arouse irrational passions. And he uses Homer as an example of this. And he understood, I mean, he's probably the philosopher, in my opinion, who's closest to poetry, which is why he was so scared of poetry and thought poetry was dangerous to the Republic, because its unruliness points to the world of feeling. And I mean, for me, the point of this associative thinking or this associative logic is to get to our affective lives, to get to our emotional lives, what's uncovering it. If you want data in how people lived, it's better to go to novels. Balzac will tell you a lot more about what it was like to live in the 19th century France than, say, Rimbaud will. But if you want to know what it felt like, then you turn to the poets. It's not that there isn't descriptive value in their work, but it's this other, I'd say, affective realm or unconscious realm that is particularly the domain of poetry. Hi, Amy.
Wow.
That's Amy Sherman, everyone. She's my classmate in folklore from the University of Pennsylvania.
Hi,
She knows about people's
this is Jonathan
stories.
Blunk. This is Jonathan Blunk. Hi, Ed.
Hi, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Wonderful to hear you read. I couldn't help but notice James Wright making an appearance in your baker's poem. The baker in the white apron and the flower on his shoes, as it would have been in the fruits of the season in Padua, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about the troubadour song that you read and that you shared. You were in the process of writing it when you learned that Gabriel had disappeared. I'm curious about the rhyme pattern that you were working in, and whether in your experience, perhaps in that poem or in other poems, how does it become clear to you that you're working in a rhyme pattern? I mean, were you hearing, say, Theodor Roethke in your mind when you were working out those stanzas, or was that something that happened in the process of revision, that you knew you were working within a form?
In this case, I was trying to imitate the 12th century troubadours, and the beginning, which is the beginning of European poetry. And so I knew I wanted this refrain of how nothing came to me, and I wanted to kind of dramatize it. So it wasn't anything. I mean, maybe I love Roethke, so it's possible that it's in somewhere in my mind. But what I was imitating was literally the way the troubadours, the sing-song quality of their melodies, because those poems were sung, and so I wanted something that seemed song-like, and the rhythm and the rhyme was a way to do that. So I was just reading a lot of troubadour poetry and thinking about the beginning of European poetry, and so in this case I knew it would rhyme, and I was just looking for the echoes of the refrain to create this sort of trance-like quality of someone riding on a horse alone and then going into the cemetery. But Jonathan is the biographer of James Wright and knows very well about how James Wright turned in this journey towards the end of his life to these beautiful rhyming poems, which he was always very good at.
Yeah.
Unlike a lot of free verse poets who abandoned rhyming and found their voices in the 50s and 60s, James Wright abandoned rhyming, but always was good at it, and returned to it at the end of his life.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that poem of yours, the Troubadour Song, really has a very haunting quality to it. It's very beautiful.
Thank you. Since on the subject, this may be a chance to say something about forms, which is that I don't like the argument about form versus no form. I think it's a non-argument. And some people believe in rhyming as if it's going to save us, and some people are against rhyming as if rhyming will damn us. But it's just another tool in the box, and that, like all the forms, they can do certain things in form that get to certain emotions or feelings or arguments that you can't get without them. And so the reason for that is because the form can deliver something that you can't get otherwise. That's the purpose of it. And then you can also engage with the history of the form. So if you want to write something, say, that's argumentative, or you want to make the case, there's a reason that the notaries in 12th century Sicily started, these legal minds hit upon the sonnet as a form. It's an argumentative form. So if you want to write an argumentative poem and you want to engage with the history of those arguments, then the sonnet is at one place to do that. It's not that the sonnet will save you or that the sonnet is better than some other form that's not prescribed. It's that the sonnet does certain work that other things don't do. And that's what I was looking for with the Troubadour Song. I felt that it could create a kind of haunting music through repetition that I couldn't get otherwise. It's a one-time form for me.
Jonathan, so you're a biographer of James Wright, is that correct?
That's right. Yes.
Amazing, because I was thinking of him when Ed read the wonderful passage about parents, poets as parents, and I thought of this moment in the life of Franz and James Wright, when James, having read for the first time some of Franz's poems, his son wrote him back and said, "Well, I'll be damned, son, you're a poet. Welcome to hell." I am curious about their relationship. If you could tell us a little bit about it. Did they ever confer more intimately about poetry?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No. I mean, James Wright was very much a mentor to Franz and his poetry. And although Franz loved to use that anecdote to say that his father was, casting him aside, and he's taking it out of context. I mean, in a sense, his father was welcoming him into a tribe. I mean, it wasn't meant to discourage him, certainly not in the least. If anything, he welcomed going over his son's poems, and I think it shows, especially in Franz's earliest poems. Franz was an excellent translator too. I sorely wish that Franz had still been alive when my book was published, because there would have been some marvelous arguments that I would have loved to have had with him.
What arguments would you have had with him?
Oh, I'm of course, as a biographer, it took a long time to get James Wright's widow, who's still very much with us. Annie Wright is 95, and I still see her a great deal. But she took a long time, and part of the reason it took me so long to finish my book was that she did not believe when I first was engaged to do this that James's, say, his alcoholism had much place in the story, and of course that's kind of ridiculous to consider. But the only reason to write a biography is to tell the full truth to the best that you're able, and it took her a long while to accept that as my goal in writing the book. With Franz, he was invested in a story about his father that I feel was fictionalized in a sense about what a terrible person his father was, and what a brutal childhood Franz had, and it really doesn't bear up scrutiny. And so there's also a way in which Franz was convinced that his younger brother, Marshall, who was troubled, had psychological difficulties. He's still very much alive too. But when James Wright was dying in the hospital, Franz was convinced that that James Wright knew that Marshall had come to visit him and had refused to see him. And the truth is that James didn't know that Marshall had come or was there, and that it was actually Annie Wright who didn't allow Marshall to see his father, in part because Marshall was very fragile at that point and had just had a mental breakdown, and his father in the hospital was, I mean, it was a brutal kind of, I mean, he had had a tracheotomy, and he had lost 60 or 70 pounds and looked very little like what his son might have remembered him as. And so there was but Franz took this very seriously, that his father had, it was important for Franz to believe that his father had refused to see his brother. And that's one of the arguments I know would have come up. There was a way in which Franz needed to blame his father for things, for his own poetic project, I think, in some measure.
Annie and I are friends, and we once had a disagreement, and Franz and I were not friends, and we had a more vehement disagreement in public once. My disagreement with Annie was, we did an event for Poets House together about this journey, and she was talking about their radiant trip to Italy, which of course she knew all about, and she had a very strong feeling about that, and I totally agree with that. But I believe that in thinking about Italy and paradise for him, you also have to think about Ohio and hell, which is never very far away. And she didn't like thinking about Ohio. This is just the difference between poetry and life. And I don't blame her. She did a tremendous amount to rescue him, I would say, from alcoholism. And they had this paradisal trip. But I think the poetry that gets its energy a lot from the contrast between the world of where he came from in Martins Ferry, Ohio, and all those poems about Martins Ferry versus the world of Italy. But that was a friendly discussion. But at the Dodge Festival, I was in a session with Franz, and we were talking to about 400 or 500 high school teachers, and they were asking us questions about poetry, and I was doing my thing. And then he said, "You shouldn't read poetry. It's dangerous. And it leads to bad things, because you shouldn't write it. It comes from hell. Only if you're absolutely doomed to write should you write." And I said, I don't care what you think personally, but that's just the wrong thing to say to high school teachers, 500 people who are gathered here to try and teach kids about poetry. And you're just, anyway, we really got into it. I just absolutely, from a pedagogical point of view, I thought that what he was saying was poisonous.
Mm.
And it may have helped him write his own poems. That's fine. I like a lot of his poems. He had his own story. He had his own reason. He had his own demons. I totally respect that. But I don't respect that as a position to tell high school teachers who are bucking a system to try and bring poetry to kids. And I just think, get out of your own way, because it's really hard to keep something alive in our country right now. And it was then, it always has been. It's hard to keep poetry alive in schools. And here are a group of teachers who are trying to do that. And I think you should encourage them instead of discouraging them. And he didn't back down, of course, but it was, you can tell, it was vehement. And he was just, I think he was not, in my opinion, a teacher. He was invested in his own tormented story. And it led to some really good translations, and it led to some really good poems. And he himself had his own learning. But as a pedagogical perspective, I believe it was wrong, and I stand by that. And we had it out, and we had it out a few times in public over this very subject, whether reading poetry was healthy or not, and whether you should encourage people to do it or not. And he was telling them that they should not,
Yeah.
and I was saying that they should, and that we're just on different sides of that.
Ed,
I have-
could you,
I'm sorry, is it okay if I jump
Yeah.
in real? I have a kind
Yeah.
of related question. In her 90s, my grandmother began to recite Keats' Endymion, and she faltered, and I was able to pick up the line and finish the verse for her. And it was something she'd learned in public school in Brooklyn at the turn of the century, a poor child of immigrants. And I want to understand what happened that poor children in public schools in Brooklyn at the turn of the century were taught to memorize Keats, and this was to help them become citizens. And why is poetry now considered elitist? And why is it something we don't seem to teach in public school anymore? I don't know. Is that weird? Is that coming out of left field? But I feel very passionately that
It's not a left field, but I don't know if I can answer it. It's a complicated question. I think that it probably has to do with all kinds of things. The pragmatic streak in American education. Another, the schoolroom poets of the 19th century. The most famous was Longfellow. Were extremely popular, and sort of telling tales that reassured people about the way we live. And their poems rhyme and are very memorable. And some of them are quite good. If you think of Whittier, who was an abolitionist, and some of Longfellow's poems and others. But that wasn't suited to the modern world, and modernism blew open the narrative. Evan Boland, who was a dear friend of mine, believed that modernism made a rupture between the poets and the audience. What was never broken, in her opinion, was never broken in Ireland. That there was always the link between the poets and their audience in Ireland, but that in the United States, modernism had broken this with the commitment to difficulty and fragmentation. I mean, there's a lot of arguments for why. I don't want to go into the history of why Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot believed in collage and what collage did and how it suited the modern world. But there was a reason that William Carlos Williams believed that the wasteland had set back American poetry by 20 years, because it was no longer speaking in a plain language to an American audience. So there's a complicated story here, Lisa, about the development on the one hand of poetry in America in the 20th century, and then on the other hand, the development of pedagogy in the United States and in schools. And they started to go on rival tracks, I would say. But if you have any of whenever like poets like Derek Walcott or Seamus Heaney or Joseph Brodsky, poets I really greatly admire, and intellectuals I greatly admire. They always had their students memorizing poems. They thought it was important as a part of a poetry education. And of course, Jonathan's guy, James Wright, had a just near photographic memory and knowledge of poetry. But your story of your was it your grandmother?
My grandmother, yes.
Your grandmother does sort of teach you something, which is if you memorize poems, especially when you're young, you have them for your life. You don't they're with you, they're part of you in a way that you don't have them if you never memorized poems. So, but it just became like a lot of other things, sort of not part of the curriculum anymore.
I feel like I have a memory of you maybe saying in a class I took that when you recite a poem, you are making the same sounds that the poet made, and that their language is living in your body in sort of a similar way that it lived in theirs. I don't know. I have this vague memory of something that was very
Yes, but yes,
that
what I'm saying, my argument is not actually quite that, but it's close to that, which is that poetry is, and Robert Pinsky's made quite a lot out of this himself, as an argument about poetry. When you poetry is a form that when you recite it, you become the vehicle of that poem. That the poet's voice becomes your voice, and your breath, your body, your vocal cords, your lung, your voice become the embodiment of that poet. You are not T.S. Eliot, you are you. And so but you're not just you. You're not just reciting your own thing. You're reciting their thing, but that you have a part to play, and that your reciting of it makes it alive in a different way. And it becomes, you become the vehicle. I don't think poems are realized when they just sit there on the page. They're realized, activated when someone reads them or recites them. That's why Robert Graves called it stored magic. It's not, it's stored. It's waiting to be released, sometimes for centuries, till someone reads it or brings it alive or recites it. When you recite it, you bring it alive, so that your vocal cords, you are the vehicle of this poem, and so you have a crucial part to play. You don't recite it the way they recited it. You probably don't even hear it the way they heard it. That would be virtually impossible historically, but you do give it life. And so that's what I'm talking about. You breathe life into it. It's like the golem. It's not alive until you interact with it. You bring it alive.
I just thought of something when you said that when you recite a poem, the poem also brings you alive because it's in your body, in your gestures, in your voice, in your movement. And I think working with kids, that's one way to really get them involved in poetry.
Yes, instead of just seeing it as someone else's, it becomes yours. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, though. I had this sometimes reciting Gerard Manley Hopkins, where you're reciting it and you feel you're with it, and then there's a line you don't like, and then you feel you're not with it, or he says something that you don't like. Usually Anglican for me, but you're not allowed to edit it out. But it's not you exactly. I mean, every once in a while, Borges talks about this. Every once in a while, you have this exhilarated feeling that you are actually writing the thing to which you are only reciting or responding to. That is so in harmony are you with the poem that you're reading, so much does it speak to your inner life, that you, as a vehicle, feel that you are actually creating the thing to which you're actually only responding. That doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's really thrilling. And that part is addicting because it means that poets who've come before you have given you access to your emotional life that you can't get to otherwise. That you find something that articulates your own life to you in a way that you could not have done it yourself. And for me, the reason I'm bringing up Hopkins is when I was in college, this happened to me with one of the so-called terrible sonnets. I started reading the one, I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. And suddenly I felt delivered to myself. And I would not have been able to put it this way, but I later began to understand that this is actually a kind of metaphor of what poetry is. That here, instead of, here's this 19th century Anglican priest writing at 3 removes, as he said, in Ireland, and he's writing these despondent sonnets. And here I am, a Jewish kid from Chicago in my dorm room in Chicago. And I read this poem, I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours, oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What sights you heart saw, ways you went, and more must, yet longer lights delay. And I feel that this has articulated my own life better than my friends or anything anyone has said to me. You go, well, this is mysterious about poetry, that someone long dead speaks to you more vividly than the people around you. And that's where I began to feel the depth charge of what poetry can do as a kind of communication of solitaries, just you and the poem of this long dead poet. And it awakens your own inner life, your own interiority in a way that you could not do on your own. It gives you access to yourself in a way that you didn't, this has been true for me, that I just didn't have otherwise.
I have a question for Ed. I also have a footnote to Lisa, but I'll wait for later for that. Ed, everything you've been saying, and since you're talking about your dispute with Franz about pedagogy, everything you've been saying is about the power of poetry and how important it is and what it does for people. I'm curious whether, it seems to me that's a fabulous answer to Franz's point that it was evil. And I'm curious, why not just argue it on the merits? Why try to stop him from making the pedagogical point? Let him make the pedagogical point and say, no, you're wrong. Poetry is really valuable. It's not evil. It's terrific. And here are all the reasons it's terrific.
I don't understand what you're saying. That's what happened.
Oh,
He's making his points, and then I argued with him, and then he made his points again, and then I argued with him. It was a public discussion, so I wasn't silencing him.
I thought what you were saying publicly was that I misunderstood. You weren't saying publicly you shouldn't tell these teachers that because they're teachers and they have.
I'm saying I don't agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. Fine.
I think you're an asshole for saying this to these teachers who are trying to do the Lord's work, but go ahead. I'm not going to stop you from saying this idiotic shit, but I don't agree with this at all. And that I think that you should really wake up to the rest of the world, and that there are teachers here who are really trying to do something in the world, and you should, get off it. But I didn't stop him from talking. You couldn't stop Franz Wright from talking, and nor was I even trying to. I just didn't agree with him at all.
Great.
I still
So
don't.
that's
You
great.
see, I like to get him. I wish he would come back so I could argue with him some more.
I just want to also confirm your point about Lisa's grandmother. My father was of that generation, Jewish immigrant child, went to the public schools in New York, and he learned by heart Keats. And he not only did he learn Keats, he learned Rudyard Kipling's British imperialist stuff and Longfellow and all that stuff. So I think both of those things were going on. And he taught me all those poems. So even though they weren't part of my curriculum, that whole tradition moved on for a generation.
I can comment a little bit about, let's say, the censoring of poetry or even its canceling. You know, there's a mistaken critique that poetry is part of Western imperialism and patriarchal culture. And there's sort of a blanket, not even condemnation, but cancellation of its relevance and worthiness as a field of study. Eddie just told me they eliminated poetry from the PhD curriculum at Princeton in English, for example. And I do know over there at Princeton, as much as I admire the university, that there's been reconsiderations of the influence of, let's call it, Western culture and its suppression of others, so that there's a kind of self-searching and self-hatred that's going on among many of its academics. And there's a strenuous zeitgeist of the elimination of unworthy influences upon the psyche and the minds of our students. It's a very troubling thing to me because nothing is pure, and yet this is an effort to constitute a kind of purity of mind and purity of morals, which is tremendously reminiscent of, to me, the Puritans in Cotton Mather and their intolerance. And it, above all things, that it's a flattering of intolerance. It's a promulgation of intolerance itself. It is not a widening. And it disturbs me a good deal. I had a student that I fought to admit at our MFA program here in Oregon, who came from Stanford, was a student of Evans and I believe Louise Glix, rest her soul, and Evans too, whose second or third sentence to me was that she came from a decolonized education at Stanford. And I asked her what that meant. And she said, well, she doesn't really read Western imperialism and its poetry. You know, this is my seminar is in traditional poetic genres, and I start with Theocritus. I go next to Virgil, and then this week I'm teaching Horace. You know, and as a sort of post-colonial myself, and as Derek Walcott is as well, we internalize, let's call it, the rapture and the music and the elegance of all this poetry, and also read into it our own circumstance. For example, I look at Theocritus as post-colonial, being Syrian writing in, Sicilian writing in Alexandria, and Virgil is a poet of diaspora and dispossession. But this is not so much a project to transform them, but to transform the reception and the cancellation. But I've seen that it's much easier and much more universal that all of this is canceled. And it disturbs me a great deal. I think it's a funny moment in cultural history. This is happening. I didn't say this to my prospect or my new student, but I liken the idea of the decolonized education as the burning of the books by the 3rd century emperor of China, you know, so that history could start from him. And to me, it's a fascist gesture. But we can't convince our entire culture, our educational system, and sort of dissuade them from their hostility for poetry as an elite and imperialistic practice. It's unfortunately a losing battle, I feel. And they're in the MFA programs nationally, there I think only 2 which uphold literary history actively in their teaching. The rest are simply stylistic workshops, if I may say, you know. But Vanderbilt is the only other place now that still teaches poetic history and poetic tradition. After Mary Jo Salter retired at Hopkins, it's no longer a central value in that program, and I lament this quite a bit.
Which are the 2? I missed that. Which are the 2 that still teach it?
Well, in my feeling, in my very, very prejudiced feeling, and I will say it's prejudiced and limited, I feel that Oregon and Vanderbilt uphold literary tradition, not without critique, but as tradition. Now there are pockets, of course, the incredible people like Linda Gregerson teaching at Michigan, and there are people, Eddie teaching at NYU, but it feels like we're on the losing side already. I'm sorry to say this, but I feel disheartened a bit.
Yeah.
It's
We're
disheartening.
gonna go down with the ship, Garrett, but you're not, I mean, we're gonna keep fighting the fight, but you're right, we're going against we're going against the whole culture. The thing,
can hide- yeah.
the positive side here, I'd say, is the truth that there's never been a culture without poetry. And so even though we have somewhat limited minds, and we're at a very narrow, in my opinion, very narrow moment that's eliminating much more than it's including. Historically, poetry will survive this in a different, it won't be the same, but it will survive this because the way that poetry thinks brings something to culture that we can't get otherwise. And this is true in all cultures. So it's true for ours too. So we're going against an enormous force here. On the one hand, the larger ignorance of the capitalist culture, which pretty much does away with anything that you can't sell, anything that's not commodified. And then the problematics of the left that you're describing, who are mostly in charge now of creative writing programs and English departments, and their tremendous suspicion of poetry. But the poetry nonetheless still survives and will survive this. It's just we don't want to be the ones who killed it.
Yeah.
As we were accused of being young, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Garrett, just to jump in here. Hi, I'm Richard Osler from Canada. And I have learned poetry and taught poetry outside of a university experience. And I'll never forget teaching at a recovery high school in Houston. You have about 200 high schools in the United States that are just for teenagers in recovery from drug and alcohol. And I remember, bringing in good old-fashioned poets in the work I was doing. And a kid pulled out, 18 years old. He said, "Have you ever heard of Rupi Kaur?" And I said, "Yes, I have." And he said, "Have you read her book?" I said, "Yes, I have." And I came back a year later, he had her new book. I think you're quite right. Poetry isn't going to die. It's going to take a new form. And we might argue, Rupi Kaur has sold 11 million copies of her books. She is talking to people as a poet. We may, disagree with her poetic values, but she's, so I feel more optimistic. I get that you guys are in more of a university context. I'm not familiar with that. But on the ground, I'm seeing people's eyes light up with poetry who have not been educated in it so far. So I just sort of throw that in. Matthew Zapruder's latest book, How to Read a Poem, he actually uses Rupi Kaur in his classes and, contrasts her with other poets, but sees the real value, and his students really respond. So I think we've got a really wonderful conversation going, but I am dismayed at your view in a way that I have not experienced.
Could I ask you a quick question, Richard Osler?
Yeah.
What interests me about Rupi Kaur, do people go from her poetry to other poetry? Or as with Rod McEwen back in the day, it would end there. They'd read Rod McEwen and that was it. And is it a springboard? Is her work a springboard onto other poetry, do you find?
Well, I love your question. I mean, I love the connection with Rob McEwen. I go into old bookstores and see all these old Rob McEwen books, and I just start to laugh. I would hope so. I mean, I think there are poems of Rupi's that have real poetic craft in them, and they really do talk to the feelings that you talk about, Ed. They really talk about feelings in that 20 to 30s. I hope so, because if you look at poets like Adonis or, Warson Shire, the Instagram poets, to me, people are moving on. And, it was interesting. Rupi Kaur was being interviewed, and she was saying that one of her great influences was Sharon Olds. She wasn't writing out of a vacuum. I don't know I've answered your question there, Suzanne, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
Good. Good.
Yeah, so we've been talking about individuals and poetry having an impact on individuals discovering poetry. And I was thinking about, well, what about poetry for entire groups, entire nations? Um, Garrett and I are from Hawaii originally, and I'm sure Garrett's familiar with the ancient Hawaiian poem of creation, the Kumolipo, which was recited from memory. It's over 1,000 lines. It was recited from memory during religious festivities, and all the people would gather, and it was a way for in this chant, with its repetitions and its rhythms, um, for an entire people to coalesce around one kind of idea, one myth. Um, an entire story, which was the basis of the creation of their people. Um, and then I'm thinking about rap music. I'm thinking about the chants during football games. Um, when people get caught up with this, and I don't know if you watched the 15 rounds of voting to pick McCarthy as the Speaker of the House, but
Yeah.
Hakeem Jeffries went up to the podium and he recited an ABC Darien poem, which was amazing. And it's been read into the official records, our national records now.
So
And I'm
Can I
thinking,
respond? Can I
yeah,
respond to what
yeah,
you're
yeah.
saying? You're talking about two different things. And I think it's worth distinguishing between them. And maybe Garrett will want to say something about this. The first example is very different than your other examples. The first example that you're talking about is you're talking about epic poetry. And you're talking about oral epics and the creation stories that every culture has. And you are distinguishing between oral poetry and written poetry. And what we've been talking about is lyric, but there also is this long history of epic. And the epic Ezra Pound said the epic is the tale of a tribe. And these stories, if I highly recommend the book The Singer of Tales by Albert Lord, and the story of the what were once Yugoslavian Slavic singers and their use of oral epics, and how that is parallel to the Iliad, especially, and the creation stories in every culture. And the nature of the epic is that it's not the oral epic, especially, is not written. It's a communal force of song that brings together a community together in a shared identity. That's different than what you're talking about with, say, hip hop. Now, hip hop is poetry. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not the same as the original epic that you're talking about. And Hakeem Jeffries reading a poem on the floor is not the same thing as the reciting of an oral epic that binds a people into their creation story. So I just think that these two different, you're talking about oral poetry, but the distinction here between the epic and the lyric really matters here, because the singer of tales of the epic is a stand-in for the community. And that's very different than the lyric singer that we're talking about. I really appreciate what you're saying about community values and the long history of that in poetry. But that is a particular form related to the epic, which is different than the other oral forms that you're talking about. Garrett, you want to say something about this?
Well, I don't disagree with either of you really, but I think May was heading towards a point, even if she didn't make the distinctions that you're making right now. And I'd like to hear her finish making that point before I comment, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sorry, May. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, now I've lost my point. But so so with Hakeem Jeffries, and then there Robert Kennedy campaigning, and he went to this was on the train to make this campaign speech, and I forget which city it was. He heard the news that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, and he was headed for this city. It was in the poor section of this town, and he knew that the majority of the people there, a lot of his supporters, were African Americans. So he made changes to his speech. He threw his speech out. He wrote a speech on this train, like Lincoln did on the way to Gettysburg, um, and made this speech. And he quoted Aeschylus, those lines about uh, the bitterness dripping drop by drop on our heart, and eventually in our sorrows, in our sleep. Um, it brings the awful wisdom. And he talked about his brother having been assassinated, and he begged for peace because these other cities had been breaking out into riots, and that was one of the very few cities in the U.S. where there was no rioting. In the aftermath of all that horror. So I, I guess what I'm saying is, and you alluded to this, Ed. You began talking about how poetry will always be among us, and there are no cultures without poetry. Um, Maybe that's a human thing. Maybe we can't be humans without needing poetry and also without making poetry on some level. Oh, and I'm also thinking of the land days, I think they're called. Afghan women, they're illiterate. And they have this generational of memorization. I think they're like 3-line poems that these women have passed amongst themselves in little groups, um, about war, about love, about being a woman in a patriarchal society. Um, anyway. I don't know, Garrett, where was I heading?
But Kumolipo and many things like that, there, and then even the improvised tales of the Yugoslavian singers that Ed was talking about, they exist in a culture that in some ways is fairly cohesive and undisturbed by postmodernity, industrialization. It's arguable regarding Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav singers, but there's a kind of continuity and a cohesion. We're living in a multiplicity of influences and, of course, debate, and without a centralized culture, except that of fascism, which, frankly, we seem to be tending towards. Um, and Eddie's talking about the lyric singer as an individual and an expressive individual. So in that sense, I agree with Ed. There's two things. So the question becomes, how do we formulate around, let's say, a culture of commonality, and poetry and its study, let's say, in the 19th century, may have been part of a nationalistic enterprise in America. The idea of assimilation and acculturation that Lisa was talking about, and that is the critique. And to me, is fairly legitimate among the zealous left. And in that sense, I hesitantly agree. The idea of entire cancellation, the idea of the hostility that is enabled by that action, is the kind of irrationality that Plato mistrusted. It is the kind of hubristic terror and fury and rage that Aristotle hoped tragedy would purge from the human body, right, in the Poetics. And I see among so many of the young these rigidities and these assurances and this quest for certainty, because we do live in multiplicity, it's very difficult to justify the lyric singer when we have such lack in terms of commonality. So that's a legitimate critique in some ways. But the persecution of lyricism, the persecution of the lyric tradition, the persecution of really the Western tradition is a misplaced, blanket and foolish, irrational leap towards that out of the dissatisfaction that we exist without a kind of commonality. The question then becomes, okay, we have these freedoms of expression that we can create, and we all engage in them, and we can engage in them in these smaller groups as we're doing today. And Eddie's right that poetry has always been part of things. What we lack of maybe is the major poetry. We are not a communal culture completely. We do not live in complete unisonance. We live in a lot of dissonance. And I think that that's the position of the lyric singer. It is a kind of attempt to create a community within the self of the left and the right, as Eddie's poem pointed out, but also between I and thou, right? It's to start with one. It's to start with one other. Even in Hobbes, he talks about the beginning of a nation as the sympathy between one and another. And this is, I think, what the lyric voice does. It produces the potential for that kind of sympathy. And I'm just not willing to do without it. But the erasure, the cancellation, the hostility for the enterprise sometimes discourages me, not from writing poetry, not from believing in poetry, not for living in poetry myself, but indeed for affecting the culture and the young. I talked to how should I put it, zealots and radicals, but also conservatives. And they strike me as the commonality between them is their own fascism. And this is what's disappointing. And their quest for certainty.
Hello.
Garrett, I want to follow up on something that May said, if I can, which is I want to distinguish in her examples because she's talking about a lot of different things that are interesting, but they're really different. For example, the Robert Kennedy example is a use of poetry as rhetoric. And it uses a poet moment. Biden does this too. Bill Clinton did it too, where you take poetry and you use it to unify people in a speech publicly. The Land Day that you referenced is something totally different, and in my opinion, much more significant. That's an oral form that Afghan women have. It's too dangerous for them to write these poems down. They can only be spoken because it's so dangerous for Afghan women to express themselves. It is a communal way of women to articulate an anti-male perspective, or even just the perspective that they have themselves as women. And it is a important form of folklore in which people pass down their political ideas, but also their social ideas, their maternal ideas. A lot of these poems are quite radical. A lot of them are against war. A lot of them are against patriarchal culture, and they bind women together, and they combine these short 3-line poems combined to they're constantly changing, they're being added to, but they're also being passed on the way traditional culture is. And this is a tremendously binding form of oral poetry for specifically amongst Afghan women, which it's interesting because it's a gendered form. Men don't sing Land Days, and men don't say Land Days. So that to me is an important form of folk poetry that you're talking about, May, which is really different than the original epic that you were talking about, the Hawaiian epic, and different than the marshaling politically of poems that can that we can call on at different public moments of grief to try and unite us. It's not accidental that at funerals and weddings and occasions of state, some people, the more literate side of our culture, turn to poems to help articulate feelings that they don't otherwise have. But I just want to underline the thing that you're saying, because I think this, not everyone knows about this Afghan form, and it's incredible. It's absolutely extraordinary form of oral poetry amongst women. And it shows the way poetry can operate in culture underground as an oppositional force.
Mm.
And as a survival tactic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And not just individually, but collectively.
I was thinking of E Street Nation and Bruce Springsteen as and of course Lucian also mentioned Leonard Cohen. And so these are powerful lyrics that people in great numbers enjoy. And I think, I don't think they're going to save us or what we're talking about trying to save, but they do, I think, signify a kind of lyric appetite that is being satisfied on a larger scale. Garrett, I think, and having spent one sad year as the graduate director, I can remember all this shuffling back and forth with the MFA program about reading lists, and this is a decade or more ago, but the effort to, there's these pressures to kind of get through the program. Everybody else's program is 2 years. Why is ours 3? And and where I taught at University of South Carolina, we certainly never lost. I don't know about now, but we never lost that requirement of an acquaintance with a canonical, series of authors and the poetry that they wrote. But certainly we were talking about, is our program too long? Are we just losing good students because of the structure of other MFA programs at that time anyway? And I love, just to say, I love this idea of filling in the blank for your grandmother and Lisa, and talking. I remember Charles said at the beginning about, not really moving on from book to book, and then kind of maybe going back to an earlier one to remember who he was then. But it seems to me that that beautiful thing that happens with remembered poetry and conversations, among people who have shared it, that there is a kind of continuity to self there, that generation can speak to generation. It's a, not an institutional thing. This was more of a family thing, but that the memorization of poetry gives you this kind of reservoir, not only bringing the past to life, but also, if you're lucky enough to have started a poetry club when you're in high school with a friend, or worked on a literary magazine when you're in college, and you remember the poems that you love. I have a dear friend that I did start a poetry club with when I was in high school, and I did teach high school for a decade and require my students to memorize poems. And it was always great fun because they didn't like it, and then all of a sudden they did, because it was theater. It was, their friends who were having to, in a way, become at least an impersonator for a moment. And I would have happily done more of it, but I know that the poetry that I loved and memorized when I was in my late teens and first in college, it just keeps coming up when I write something or when I try to find words for something. And my wife just happens to be a card-carrying member of East Street Nation, and she drives around from gardening spot to gardening spot. She has a gardening business. And whenever I use her car, there's Bruce right there. And you know, it's wonderful stuff. It's not the poetry that I go to routinely out of my own love and experience of poetry, but it is a kind of lyrical community, you might say.
Ed, do you have any interest at all in talking about something that sort of doesn't sort of interest me, it does interest me, the state of contemporary literary criticism, especially as it concerns poetry? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'd kind of be the last to know because when I was, you know, teaching, first of all, I did teach, as I said, I started, you know, teaching junior high. Actually, I mean, I was reminded, I have a poem from way back when called Mythology Class, which was when I was teaching. Actually, I had the good fortune to teach in Rome for a couple of years when I first graduated. So this talk about James Wright, actually Annie Wright, taught at the school, the American, I forget, it's a school where I taught though. She was an elementary school teacher there 10 years, 10 years before. But now I've forgotten the question though. I get the self emerged and the question was dropped. What was it? Oh, you were asking, what were you asking about?
The state of criticism.
Contemporary literary criticism.
Or Ed, I was also, as
yeah.
well as you, I was also asking Ed.
I just have a very short thing to say. Ever since Ed stopped writing in the New Yorker, the state of criticism of contemporary poetry has declined precipitously.
Thanks, Garrett.
Maybe that will induce Ed to go back to doing that. We can hope.
I did write this book called The Heart of American Poetry, which I like, and it has a chapter about Garrett in it, by the way. And our friendship and his poetry project. The book starts with Anne Bradstreet and it ends with Garrett and Joy Harjo. The state of, I don't think you could call it literary criticism. It's literary theory in the academy, and it's extremely, with a couple of exceptions, it's very suspicious of poetry. It's vengeance on poetry and its priorities. I think that I wouldn't say it's completely lost the academy, but I'd say that it's so suspicious of poetry in terms of literary theory that it's doing its I can't think that academic criticism right now is trying to keep poetry alive. I do not think it is actually. I have Garrett and I share this, the great books that we loved from college by F.O. Matheson and Alfred Kazin and others were the books that introduced us to poetry. Some of it was quite critical, like Randall Jarrell's essays. But although his essays of appreciation are, I think, beyond words, his essay on Whitman, his essays on Frost and the rescue operations there. But I think the kind of idea that I have, a somewhat old-fashioned idea in my criticism of trying to help illuminate the poetry and try and understand it. Sometimes it's critical, sometimes it unearths things. It doesn't try and shy away from some of the problems, say, with Eliot or with Pound, even more so. I don't think we should turn away from their beliefs. And some of the repellent things that they have to say. On the other hand, I just think illuminating the poetry and trying to understand it and how it operates is a really helpful part of criticism. But I can't imagine that there are many critics who think this way anymore. They just don't. And so I think, and I think that when poets stopped writing criticism, which they mostly did in the Randall Jarrell, Robert Lowell, Elizabeth Bishop generation, Berriman. They were poets and scholars, and they all wrote about poetry. But the next generation of poets I greatly admire, Philip Levine, Galway Canal, Adrienne Rich was an exception, maybe in terms of the kind of criticism she wrote, though it wasn't really literary criticism. That generation of poets who were very learned stopped writing criticism, and they, in a way, and they turned over criticism to professional literary critics. And this was, I think, a tremendous abdication and a mistake, because as the natural, when poets write criticism, they have a kind of investment in the project, and especially my people, the subjective lyricists, stopped writing criticism and therefore handed over the field to literary theorists and to the language poets who were very eager to write about each other and to build their arguments for poetry. So we're partly to blame for leaving the field to others. And by leaving the field to others, the field got, I wouldn't say destroyed, but the suspicious reading of poetry, the attempt to take down poetry, if you were, to the Derridian reading of poetry, which is to undermine everything that the poet says rather than try and understand it, won the day. And maybe it was going to win, maybe it was going to win otherwise. So, I mean, I think it's important to keep fighting a rearguard action here, to try and think through what poetry can do and how it does. But now that so few poets have an interest in the education and the history of poetry, it becomes very difficult for any of the poets to make the case for poetry. Just as in the larger culture, in an even larger sense, our humanists have done a very good job, very poor job of making the case for the humanities. And the result of this is the humanities are getting completely decimated on university campuses. Now, maybe that would help, maybe that would happen anyway, but we haven't helped by not making the case. And the case really needs to be made. Otherwise, it's not going to make itself. I mean, when Princeton University stops teaching poetry, not just for its PhD program, Garrett, but for its major for undergraduates, you can major in English literature at Princeton and not take a poetry class. No one has made the case very strongly for poetry then, or at least strongly enough, as being part of even an English major, let alone a liberal arts education. So I think there are a lot of forces at work here. And it's not just all our fault. But I also think that our poets haven't stood up to make the case on behalf of poetry to the larger culture.
Well,
We're
y'all,
here.
we better start
We're
making
here.
the case. Let's
We're
start
here to
making
make
the
the case.
case.
We're here. We're here.
I've been going to open mic readings. Yes, taking the slings and arrows and to my ears.
You're a brave woman.
But over and over again, and yeah, I kind of expected it from younger poets just starting out. You know, the broken love affairs and the how great drugs are. Yeah, you know, over and over again. But now they're older. They look to be in their 30s and they're still writing these poems and they're all narcissistic. The eye is at center and there is almost nothing else about the poem. And I get up and I read my poem about the recent Canadian fires and atmospheric climate change and the birds disappearing from my backyard, and they're all blown away. And um, so on behalf of these young people who have poetry moving in them, but they have no idea what else they could possibly write about because they haven't been exposed and they don't read and they're not encouraged to read. As a matter of fact, they somehow believe that it would be evil and wrong of them to read classic poets, poets who might have been misogynist or poets who might have been, part of some authoritarian government, 100 and 200 years ago, imperialistic government. Um, on behalf of them, yeah, let's fight, for these young up and coming poets so they have something else to write about in their own poetry going forward. They're the poets of the future. They're going to be teaching poetry in the future, please. Well, I don't know what they're going to be teaching. It won't be poetry.
I find, well, I want to second what you said and say I've seen 2.5 generations of poets in Los Angeles now, and founded a thing called the Los Angeles Poetry Festival that ran for many, many years. And so I got to know the poets of Los Angeles at every level, from the most advanced level to the not at beginning level. And the groups that you're talking about, there is a layer of poets who stay stuck in the same place for their whole lives, They're not usually the ones who go on and teach. I hope. I think the ones who go on and teach do have to read in order to teach in a serious college or any sort of serious venue. But I notice that there's just a certain stratum of poets who are just happy to go up there to the open mic. They get 5 minutes and talk about themselves. And that might be as far as it goes for them. And so you're a little bit more ambitious for them than I am. You're saying, come on, young, stuck in the same place poets, And I'm saying, okay, if that's where you want to be, but I don't think we should give up hope that there are lots of other poets who are eager to read and might start at the open mic level. I did. I mean, the first reading I ever gave was at 5 minutes at an open mic, but I didn't want to stay there for the rest of my life. So is that either hope? I don't know if what I said is despairing or hopeful, or neither, or both.
I just want to jump in. Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I just love this conversation so much. And it's so interesting what you brought up, Suzanne, about people that just want to say something about themselves. And, yes, there can be a negative aspect to that. But there's also this great longing for connection that in one of his books, Ed wrote the How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry is I love that book so much. And he writes about the idea of a poem, the concept of it as a message in a bottle, like you're in a desert island and you write the one thing, you want to write your message and you throw it out and someone reads it, anyone through history, through time. But there's this connection, right? Like this magic when it gets uncorked and you all of a sudden have this, and it seems like, I don't know, there's a need for people, maybe they're untrained, and what you're saying too is the need for actual training and reading of poetry. I don't know. I just get excited hearing about what that magic is and what people are hungry for and how to bring that about in a more effective and more wonderful way. So yeah.
I think the thing you're talking about, Elizabeth, is interesting. The difference between the open mic and the message in the bottle is almost a difference in form. I mean, it's all called poetry, but really it's quite a different thing. And what it's, I'm not saying it's not poetry, but it's of a different order or different type, just generically. And I think that what May is objecting to in these poems is, in my opinion, not the poets or not what they're writing about, but the conventional way in which they're just actually expressing the same thing over and over again because they don't have any other formal means. And the open mic is its own form. And the form is determining it. So that's why the poems sound alike, because the poems are in a certain kind of form. That it has its own power and it has its own experience. It's very different than what I'm talking about as a message in a bottle, because the message in a bottle, which is an idea I got from Paul Celan, which is an idea that he got from Osip Mandelstam, was a poem is a message in a bottle sent out in the not always greatly hopeful belief that somewhere and sometime it would wash up on land, on Heartland perhaps. This is the idea of the poet making something and creating something from their own breath, their own life, and inscribing it, turning it into something, transforming it into something on the page, and then folding that into a bottle or publishing it in a book or leaving it in a manuscript and hoping that someone will find it in the future. And when someone finds it in the future and reads it, it speaks to their inner life.
Yeah.
Celan got this idea from Mandelstam, who wrote a little piece in 1918 called On the Addressee. And what Mandelstam is saying is that a wayfarer goes down to the beach and he sees an unlikely looking bottle on the shore. And he picks it up and opens it. And then Mandelstam says, quite amusingly, I think, I'm not reading someone else's mail. It was addressed to whoever found it. I found it. Therefore, it was addressed to me. And that's the lyric exchange that we're talking about historically between people who are not physically present to each other, which is really different than a slam or open mic. This is a kind of interaction between people who are strangers to each other, who may not even be alive at the same time, who find a connection through language, through words that open up the living person's interior life. And it may be confusing to even call them, they're all under the name of poetry, but they're not really the same forms of poetry. And they have different functions in poetry, as different genres in poetry.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. I just love hearing you talk about the message in the bottle. And I guess to me, it feels like that the hunger, but behind why do poetry or why read it, or has that, essence in it. And you're so right that the forms are very different. But I just like hearing you talk about it and as much as possible.
I have an old-fashioned idea that the purpose of poetry is to describe the way we felt about life here, not just for the people who are here now with us, but for the future. I still have this idea because so many poets of the past have enriched my life, that I still have this idea that you can leave something behind. And that my notion is that there's something unbearable about our human mortality. And that's the way things pass. And that this is certainly on my mind these days because I'm losing so many people who've meant so much to me. And that it's unbearable, but that it can be recorded and remembered, and that you pass on something to the future as things have been passed on to me. And that poetry leaves a kind of intense emotional record of what it was like to be here. And I think that's a bit different than just trying to express yourself.
Yeah.
And it's also not only on behalf of yourself. it's on behalf of the people and the things that have meant something to you. And so that everything won't just be forgotten. And maybe in the end, it all will be. But I feel as poets, we try to do our part to leave behind some trace, some record of what it was like to be here. And I don't believe that's narcissistic. I believe it's a kind of legacy that people have given to us, and that we're in a link to a chain and try and pass something forward. And oral poets, historically, this is what they were doing too. They were listening to stories and changing those stories and passing those stories on to younger people, to bind communities, but also to give a record of our founding, our passing, what we were like, what it felt like. Whether you're talking about epic scale, the foundations of people, or whether you're talking about 3-line land days about what it's like to be a woman in living in rural Afghanistan. Because the land day is pretty much a rural form, because it's amongst illiterate women, basically, as a form of poetry.
This ecstatic fever for transcendence that I think you've been hinting at, you mentioned Rilke and his virtual abandonment of his daughter, Clara, and then also his wife, Ruth. But tell me, like, do you think that ecstatic fever for transcendence, or maybe to go a different direction slightly, to quote Yeats, that the intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work? Do you think ultimately that Rilke was not selfish in that sense, that he had that transcendence that was his only priority?
Rilke's a very great poet. And he certainly did the work. And I'm very grateful for the work that he left behind. I don't admire him as a person. I can't say I do. I don't like the way he sucked up to rich people. I don't like the way he lived off princes and princesses. But is Rilke a great poet? Absolutely, no question. And I'm thrilled to have the Duino elegies. I love the Neue Gedichte. I like Rilke all the way through as a poet. I prefer the vision for how to live. I prefer James Joyce's vision in Ulysses. I think that's a better model how to live. I don't like this idea of the mountaintop genius poet who sacrifices everything in his own life so that he can write his poems, including all the people. That's a personal choice, and it's a distinction between the work and the person. But Rilke is a good example because he believes in the great work above all. He probably shouldn't have had a child, is all I'll say. And that work was costly for the people that he was involved with. If you want to read a really great book of letters, you should read the book of letters between Boris Pasternak and Marina Tsvetaeva and Rainer Maria Rilke. Rilke went to Russia with Lou Andreas Salome, and he met Boris Pasternak's father, who was a painter, Leonard Pasternak. And when they had grown up and were young poets, Marina Tsvetaeva was in Paris and Boris Pasternak was in Moscow and Rilke was in Switzerland. And Pasternak drew upon the fact that he had met Rilke as a child. And This book is called Letters 1926, and they started writing to Rilke. And there's an incredible thing that Svetaeva says in one of the letters where she goes to Rilke, "You are like a fifth element, poetry itself." And there's that feeling. But one of the underlying comedies in this book is Svetaeva wants to come and meet Rilke. And the last thing Rilke wants is these young poets coming and showing up. He was dying of throat cancer in late 1938. He was already sick in 26. He doesn't want these young poets showing up. He doesn't want to talk to people in person. They revere him and want to meet him, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with that. But it's a really great book of letters about these young poets and Rilke guiding them. And Rilke ended up writing, he outlived Svetaeva and wrote a beautiful elegy for her. But as you think through the problem that we have of how to live and write, and what kind of world you want to make, if you want to have a family and how it is, and the war between trying to be a poet and trying to have a practical life, I don't think Rilke's a model, and I don't think Akhmatova is either. They're really great poets. I don't want to deny the greatness of their work, nor do I want to cancel them or anything like that. I love their work, but I don't want to live like them. And if that's the cost, I'm not willing to pay it. I'm not willing to sacrifice all the people in my personal life so that I could try to be the genius and write the work. So this is a personal choice that everyone makes. Everyone has to try and figure out how to live and write. It's not easy to manage your daily life and to have a writing life. But I also think you try to have models, and in terms of how to live. I studied very closely Rilke because it was my hero in my 20s. Of how to live. And then I changed my mind once I had a child about whether that was a good way to live. So these are interesting questions now about how, not just about poetry, but about, is there a way to commit to poetry and have a personal life?
And Ed, have you found any other models who have managed to do that we can look at and feel a little encouraged by? Since Rilke's not.
I highly urge you. In my book, The Heart of American Poetry, the first chapter is about Anne Bradstreet. And if you want to see someone who worked under real stricture, a Puritan ethic, and 8 children, and still managed to write really great poems, I think Anne Bradstreet is a remarkable model of independent thinking and creativity and learning within a very strict environment. So I like my joke at the end of the poem I wrote where John, it's not a joke, it's a quote from John Barron, but it's funny. It's where he goes, it is not a good idea to marry with poets or to be by them. Like, as if you had the choice whether or not to be by them. I like James Joyce as a model, not a poet, but as a writer, because his genius is indisputable, but the vision is humane. And the creation of Leopold Bloom is a humane model of how to live and to be in the world.
But Ed, Joyce's daughter Lucia had this schizophrenia or madness. So in extolling Joyce, can you clarify, what you're extolling about his approach?
Well, I mean, that's not his fault. What I'm talking about is the creation of the vision of Leopold Bloom and the vision of, I'm not talking about just about his daily life. Though I mean, I don't think that I don't understand schizophrenia to know well enough what the Joyces had to do with their daughter's illness. Maybe they played some part. But I think the vision of family that Joyce gives us in Ulysses is different than the model of family you get from Rilke, is all I'm saying.
Phil Levine was a great admirer for exactly to the point you're talking about, Ed. Maybe you could respond to this. I think for Phil Levine, it was Keats who was the model that you're talking about, who in his very short life reached out to everybody, tried to help the people around him, tried not to be a burden. And although we don't know who he would have turned into if he'd lived to 30, do you think, do you feel that way about Keats also in his life, that his generosity, his just kindness to people?
Keats is the most lovable person in the history of literature. In my opinion, there are 4 biographies of him, or maybe 5, and they're all good. Keats brings out, I mean, I thought Walter Jackson Bates' biography was great, but then, I mean, they're all great. Even Stanley Plumley's is really good. I mean, Keats brings out the humanity in people, and I think that's why he spoke so deeply to Phil. I mean, Keats could be pugnacious, and he had it would be interesting to hear how he sounded, because we don't have any recordings, because he had a Cockney accent. It would have been interesting to hear those. But the letters are some of the greatest literary criticism ever written. They're also heartbreaking, and the poems are tremendously humane. And I think that's what Phil is picking up with. And, you know, Keats had a medical education, and he wanted to help people. And his vision of poetry was this vision of a humane, communal poetry that spoke to people, especially in the more mature. He matured very rapidly, but it's not as much a vision in the earlier poetry, but in the middle and poetry, and then the great odes. So I don't know if you could say he's a model on how to live, because he didn't live very long.
Yeah.
But he certainly lived fully. And the records that the testaments that everyone had for him are strong. I also like, if you look at the modernists, I like William Carlos Williams as a person. I like his poetry too, but also as a person, as a doctor, and the spirit of trying to make an American poetry and to speak to other people. He was not a poet who turned his back on the audience, the way, say, that Eliot did. Even though Eliot may indisputably be a greater poet, Williams's vision is deeper to me, and more collective and more communal. It's a more upbeat, instead of the wasteland, it's a response to the wasteland, and a kind of, both Williams and Rutke try to create a reason to live beyond the wasteland. Hart Crane too, really. They're all responses to the wasteland and the despair of the wasteland. And I really resonate to this model of American literature that's more hopeful. I'm also a tremendous fan of Marianne Moore's, but I don't know if you can recommend her way of living, since she lived with Mother the whole time. And her mother was turned out to have been somewhat cruel.
Ed, I don't understand Marianne Moore's poetry. I mean, I know that in the anthologies and what M.L. Rosenthal, the little pieces we were given, there's like 1 or 2 poems that they always make you read. and I never understood what was so great and important about her. Can you say something about that to help me understand?
Yeah, well, first of all, you have an assignment to go out and read my book, The Heart of American Poetry. And in your assignment, you're supposed to read the chapter on Marion Moore on the steeplejack. And that will help you. I think the short answer is that there was an idea of how women were supposed to write, and that it was a kind of circumscribed subject matter around love, and it informs. And the embodiment of this was, say, a pretty good poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay, or Eleanor Wiley, or Sarah Teasdale, all poets I like. But Marianne Moore was trying to go against that idea of what a woman poet would be in the 1920s, and invented or reinvented this form of syllabic poetry, which was an interrogation of language, scrupulous interrogation, almost scientific investigation of how language works. And she hit upon this sort of method, objectivist method of writing poems, of creating these stanzas of each one looking exactly the same, of the same number of syllables, but the syllables varying from line to line to create a stanza, to make the poems visually arresting and more concrete, and to then get at a kind of investigation of whatever she was looking at. I mean, she's a descriptive poet, but a descriptive poet to such a degree that everything almost falls apart under the close scrutiny that she looks at it with. She puts everything under the microscope, and she observes it so closely that it becomes almost surreal. And her great disciple in this is Elizabeth Bishop. And Bishop is a more humane poet, a warmer poet, I'd say, and her descriptions are more human. But it's also another generation. I mean, what Marianne Moore had to go up against was greater, and so Marianne Moore's just extraordinary intelligence and intellective power, and then visual acuity is really, I mean, you don't go it for deep feeling. It's really, the feeling is really withheld, but you do go to it for the incredible way in which animals are described, for example. And that this is the legacy that's warmed up, I'd say, by Bishop. Remember, Bishop said that her poems were mere description. And of course, they're not mere description. They're description to such a point that suddenly it falls away and you're in some other surreal zone. This is what she got. She has a famous letter about Darwin and how Darwin looks at the world until it becomes very strange. And I think that's what's happening with Moore and Bishop, that they're looking at the world so closely visually that it becomes surreal. And you begin to understand it in another kind of way.
Great, thank you so much.
And Ed, what about, we talked about, I mean, for me, there's so many fascinating points we're covering here, but we talked about poets who could be models for living. But what about all these poets who are obviously not? You very clearly were able to parse, your appreciation for Franz Wright's work, and separate it from your dislike of certain aspects of his behavior. But what about poets like Ted Hughes, who are brilliant? I mean, you mentioned Marianne Moore's animal poems. I mean, I think Ted Hughes's animal poems are right up there too. But obviously, he had a very, very troubled life.
I'm not sure I entirely want to weigh in on that. I mean, I think that we don't have a good perspective on this, especially in his relationship with Plath. because I think it's something they created together. This is an unpopular view, but I don't personally think that she was just a victim of him. I think it was something that they did together. But I mean, to me, the great Ted Hughes is the early Ted Hughes, the early animal poems. I'm not as enthusiastic about his later Jungian work myself. That's what Robert Bly loved middle Ted Hughes, and Robert Bly loved Ted Hughes's book about Shakespeare, which I think is wacky as could be, because it's a Jungian reading. But Ted Hughes is really original in The Hawk and the Rain, and the way he described nature. And it may be that it was because of some cruelty in him that he could observe the cruelty in nature. I'm not really sure about him. I mean, he's certainly no model that way. But if you want a different view than the prevailing view that we have about Ted Hughes in terms of his relationship with women, you should read Seamus Heaney on Ted Hughes, because Ted Hughes is a tremendous model for Seamus Heaney, and who is a much more humane poet. And they did the Rattlebag together, which is a really great anthology. And Seamus Heaney's early work wouldn't have been possible without Ted Hughes's model and Ted Hughes's kindness to Seamus Heaney. If you looked at, say, the first translations of the great Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai in England, they were done with Ted Hughes and his second wife, Asa Gutman, who was from Israel, and Yehuda Amichai himself. And or if you read W.S. Merwin's memoir about being in London with Ted Hughes, you get a different picture. So, although I don't think he's a model of how to live by any means, I think that you don't need that to read his animal poems. And the thing about the animal poems, they're like Robinson Jeffers' descriptions of the California landscape. I mean, I don't want to live like Robinson Jeffers. I mean, he's damn fascist. But he described the California landscape at a time when it wasn't being described, and you might say that he understood climate change before it happened. Now, his conclusion, let's wipe out humanity, is not my conclusion. It was horrifying. But and I don't think moving out and, trying to, his sort of hatred of people is a model, but you can look to it for the way he described California and see that as a model. And so you can pick and choose. I mean, I don't have to live with Ted Hughes to read those animal poems. Just like I don't have to be an alcoholic to read John Berriman's work and agree that alcoholism is good, even though a lot of the dream songs seem to be alcoholic. So, I mean, I think we're not necessarily looking to all these poets for models on how to live. It's good when you can find one. And I think Levine found Keats as a tremendous teacher and model, because Keats also was working class. He didn't come from the same class as, say, Shelley did, or Byron or Wordsworth. He made himself into something.
Or Robert Lowell. He didn't feel too much of a connection with Robert Lowell, we know.
Phil?
Yeah.
I personally think that he did not. He liked Berriman. He didn't like Lowell, but I believe he wouldn't have said this. It was upper class Lowell, but I think it was personal. That he was at their teacher at Iowa, and Lowell really liked Donald Justice, and I think Berriman liked Phil. I mean, I hate to put it that way,
I
but
always suspected there was a little more behind it.
yeah. I mean, I don't think Lowell was going to be his kind of person anyway, but Lowell loved Snodgrass and loved Heart's Needle. and he played favorites and he loved justice. And I think Levine was never going to be Lowell's kind of poet. And Berriman saw what Levine could do. So, oh, I was once at a really funny dinner with Lowell acolytes with Phil in Boston. And they were all going, "You studied with him in Iowa. What was he like? He must have been such a great teacher." And Phil said, "Oh, yeah, he was terrible. He's a terrible teacher. He is elitist." And this Phil just launched in. It was hilarious. Phil just launched into Lowell amongst all the Lowell acolytes. So, but I don't think Phil was objective. I don't think Phil was objective there.
Yeah.
Who were the acolytes, though?
It was Frank Bedard, Lloyd Schwartz, and Gail Mazer. Bedard, Bedard owed his life to Lowell.
Yeah.
And Gail and Lloyd, all of them are friends. And Gail and Lloyd used to go to Lowell's office hours.
Yeah.
Lowell had these
Out of
office
Harvard.
hours where yeah, exactly. And he taught these people, and they used to go and they loved studying with him. And I think he paid attention to them, and people felt they got the glow. But as a regular teacher at Iowa, when Lowell was younger, he didn't have much time for everyone. And he played favorites.
It was also just on the brink of his next breakdown when Phil studied with him. So he might not have really gotten Lowell at his best, maybe.
I completely agree. Plath and Sexton were with Lowell at BU in that famous workshop. But yes, if you really want to read a really great book about Lowell, it's this, I forgot her name. It's Setting the River on Fire. It's about Lowell's schizophrenia.
It's K. Jemison.
Yeah, Kay Jamison's book is, I think, really fantastic. It's the first, I thought I'd read enough books about Lowell, but this book really gives you
Excellent.
a full, she understands the mental illness and the what he had to overcome in fighting the demons of mental illness. And instead of seeing it just through the lens of class, which is why Lowell has such a bad rap now, she sees it through the lens of mental illness, in which case Lowell's work is a kind of heroic accomplishment of overcoming real mental problems. It's a very smart, sympathetic book.
Let's see. I'm writing.
Hey,
all
by the
this-
way, Lisa, I wanted to tell you something funny about that Santa Monica workshop.
I want to hear it. I want to hear it.
Phil Levine said he was a dear friend of mine and was older. And he said that he would only teach at the Santa Monica workshop if I came and taught with him there too. So they called to tell me this, but then they said that was the good news. The bad news was Phil would only come for $4,000 and they only had 1,000 left over to pay me.
Oh.
So first of all, they said, we really need you to come because Phil won't come if you don't come, but we can only pay you 1,000. We can only pay you 1,000 because we're paying him 4,000. So I thought that was super funny. And that I came, I liked the deal. It was worth it, but just want to say it wasn't a democratic model.
Sounds like Phil was getting a little mercenary there for somebody who was so anti-capitalist. I loved the man, he was very prickly though. I have to, as you sort of pointed that out, he didn't hold back.
He liked my poem. We had to bring a poem, to the workshop to be workshopped with Phil or by Phil. And I was canny. I read his work first to see kind of what his subject matter and tone was. And I decided to think about that when I wrote my poem. So anyway, I wrote a poem and it was pretty simple. And all he said was, I like this poem and I don't think you need the last line. And I was like, Okay.
You ever read Phil's story about studying with John Berriman? And he went to John Berriman's office, and John Berriman scribbled so much over his poems and completely destroyed it that Phil dropped it in the garbage can on the way, way, way,
Oh,
way
you know
out.
what? I think that was Robert Dana. You know, it was Robert Dana. I'm pretty sure. Everybody can fact check me. But I also knew Robert Dana. And, you know, if I'm wrong, then I will fling myself off the balcony. But I think it was Robert Dana who was in that same class and
Yeah, they were
dropped it on
the
in the
story is
wastepaper
Phil's, but
basket on the way out.
they were classmates.
Yeah.
They were classmates at Iowa. Mezzi was a classmate of his too. Sorry, Garrett.
What do you
Yeah.
mean?
We don't like Mezzi very much, but he was there.
Which one?
Oh, Bob.
Mezzi?
I
No,
know.
which Nezzy
I'll
though?
have to call him Bob.
There are
He
about
was he
16 of them.
curmudgeonly? Can
Yeah.
I ask
Oh.
you? You're not, you know, I knew Bob.
Oh,
It was Bob
Bob was like Stan
curmudgeonly with
Getz, you
you?
know, when people talk about Stan Getz, they say he was a lot of nice guys and a lot of bad ones. You know,
Yeah,
Mezzi
okay,
was
got
real-
what you mean. Which Mezzi? The best Mezzi was at Iowa, I think.
The bad Mezzi was it
The
Iowa?
best Mezzi.
And I think the
The
Mezzi
best
who was
Mezzi, the
scholar,
best.
Yeah.
the scholar of Ransom and
Yeah.
Arlington and Frost, when he
Yeah.
edited volumes, those are real contributions, discernment and sensibility, and he knew a lot about.
Yeah, the Hardy too.
Yeah, I don't know that
Yeah.
as well. You're right.
He was a hardy
And
scholar.
Mez knew a lot about poetry and was very worthy to hear speak about it, but he recanted his affections at one point.
Yeah.
You know, and just sort of dismissed his early admiration for poets like Miguel Hernandez and even Lipo Bojui. And he felt that British and American formalism was the only allowable kind of poetry.
He became
He was
very
a difficult,
doctrinaire.
I
He
think,
he was very bitter. He was
I
very
also think he struggled with illness himself. You know, he told me he had different kinds of meds, and depending on what kind of med he was on, he was different. I mean, you remember that moment, Eddie, when I was having dinner with Mez in his apartment in Claremont with two scholars, and you called to let me tell me you just received the Prix de Rome.
Mhm.
And Mez was so furious that I announced to the dinner table that Edward Hirsch has just won the Prix de Rome, my friend. And Mez said, "Is that all you young poets care about is prizes?" And just cut me off at the knees. I told the story to Phil, and Phil said there was no one who cared more about prizes as a young poet than Bob Mezzi.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
He also was a very good father, though. You know, you have to hand it to him. His children, Omi and Judah, just adore him so much. He was so kind to them throughout their lives. You know, so there's a guy with a lot of sides, you know.
Yeah, he was
Yeah, he
very
also did
he was
that.
very generous to me in when I was writing my book on James Wright. He and James were
Yeah.
very close friends at Kenyon and were all lifelong friends.
Well, you know, those were his glory, to quote Bruce Springsteen, those were his glory days, those days at Kenyon when he broke through to his own consciousness. But
You know,
I also think that time with Ransom shaved down, you know, his sort of Jewish legacy. So there were just too many contradictions for Bob to wade through in some ways. He didn't have the benefit of our generation and our embracing of multiplicities, you know. He just would dash from one extreme in some ways to another. I feel, I guess, I look upon him as an older brother who can be wayward, you know, in some ways. He was very cruel to me at times, but he was also quite generous. Well, he was just incredibly generous to my first poetry teacher, Bert Myers, when Bert was dying. I'll never be able to thank him enough for that. So there was he was a complex fellow. And then even after he and Phil fell out, he always kept that etching of Phil above his bed. I don't know if many of you know this,
Hmm.
but the cover of Ashes, that is a kind of cutout of Phil as a rabbi.
Mhm.
Bob had a copy of it, or one of them, and he always kept it above his bed.
Mm,
And it's I don't know, a poignant thing, certainly.
That's interesting. I think they
Me-
hurt each other really badly. I don't quite know what
yeah,
happened. Do you know what happened, by the way, Garrett? Because I've never heard this story. I know they were very close and they really hurt each other. And probably something Phil said to him and Bob said back to Phil. I don't know. Do you know exactly what the break was about?
Eddie might know more than I. I know what, um, you know, uh, all those guys of that generation, there was so much rivalry. I was friends with Michael Harper, as Eddie was, and also Lawson Inada and Vern Ritzala. Those three were roommates at Iowa when Michael, who's African American, and Lawson, who's Japanese American, couldn't get a room to rent in Iowa City. So Vern would go around and find a place for them to live, and they would room together. And then the landlord would find out, that
Oh my
Vern had two colored roommates, and then kick them out. And then Vern would go and find another place to live. And later in life, in midlife, they fell out with each other. Unspeakably. And I heard from each of them very nasty things. It always puzzled me. And Mez and Phil were sort of that same generation. I mean, Vern was at Iowa with Mez and also Peter Everwine. And, the rivalry was quite intense. I don't know how much of it was due to the favorites like John Justice would play or Lowell would play or all that. But I do know that eventually so many of my elders fell out with each other. Even my beloved Charles, Charles Wright. I was there when he went to patch things up with Maz. We drove from Laguna to Claremont, where Bob was teaching at Pomona, where I'd gone to college, and Charles needed a buffer. He needed a wingman, and I got enlisted because I had gone to Pomona, and he wanted me to be along when he tried to patch things up with Mez. I really don't know very much, but I do know that. I mean, even I was there when the moment when Galway and Charles had a rapprochement after having fallen out, and it was very odd. I was still a very young poet. I think it might have been my second year at Irvine as Charles's MFA student. Charles insisted that I pick Galway up at the train station and bring him to a restaurant so then they could meet on neutral ground, as Charles put it. So I've been around all these fellows. I love them, but I never really fully understood their fallings out.
well, I would say that I always suspected there was something personal. I mean, Mezzi and Levine were extremely close friends, and they had a bad falling out. I suspect there was something more personal, but I won't go into that. But publicly, I know what Phil said, and that's that Mezzi was one of the most lauded young poets of his generation. And he did Naked Poetry Anthology with Steve Berg and the new one, which is a real contribution. Mezzi had tremendous early success. Levine did not. Levine had almost none. And then Levine was teaching at Fresno and Mez was teaching at, was it Pomona already?
No, he was at Fresno too.
Oh, right. So that's, yeah, right. So they started Fresno and then Mez left. But part of their friendship, which going back to Iowa, was that Phil was unknown. And then Phil started to have some success. And Phil wrote these poems in the Names of the Lost about the Spanish Civil War. And Mezzi absolutely destroyed them. Mezzi was very, very against them. And Phil got a lot of attention for these poems. They were important to Phil because he'd spent a year in Spain and discovered the Spanish Civil War. And the Spanish Civil, I personally think these poems are tremendously important to Levine because his early work almost breaks apart from Rage. And the Spanish Civil War poets gave him an anarchist ideal and an idea of politics, which he didn't have. All he had was rage. And his early work moves from rage into his middle work, which is more elegiac. And the Spanish Civil War poems are really important, but Mezzi was very against them. Mezzi said that he had no right to write these poems. And the poems were appearing in the New Yorker, and that was the external breach around them was Mezzi's attack on Levine's poems. But I heard the story. I was not friends with Mezzi, but I was really close to Levine. So I have Levine's version. I have Levine's version of this story, but that's Levine's public version of what happened.
And the only thing that Bob ever said to me was, he just said, Phil can be very, very cruel sometimes. So
That is true.
but I do have one thing that Bob said that I think is so interesting about the evolution of American poetry. He's, as you mentioned, he was one of the most lauded young poets in the country because he won the Lamont Prize back when that was for a first book. And there were not so many prizes then as there are now, and that was a big one. And he said to me one time, you know, when I was a young poet, there were only 60 major poets in the country, 60 poets whom many people could name because of the largeness of their reputation. And I knew 57 of them personally. And now there are thousands and I don't know anybody.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, that says it in a nutshell.
You know, Sue, are you finished? I want to say
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
You just reminded me of something I've been wanting to say. I'm just trying to find a leg in to fit into the conversation. But are you finished,
Yeah.
Suzanne?
What?
Are you finished? Did you want to say something
Yes,
else?
yes, yes.
Gail,
Go ahead.
And that is, I wanted to go back to your point, Ed, about, you know, the academia and how I really loved your book when you spoke about these connections from poets in the past and how they echo as time goes on with other poets. I just love that. And I so believe in retaining past and learning from the past. And so I'm just trying to make a connection between what you're saying about the universities and poetic studies now and what's going on, and the fact that we do have so many wonderful poets to turn to and to read. And so where are they coming from? I mean, some of them have gone through academic programs and others haven't, but there's a lot of poetry out there, and that gives me a lot of hope for poetry.
I think that one of the positive things about creative writing workshops that people haven't often observed is that they're tremendously democratizing, and that the creative writing programs invited all kinds of people into the workshop that were left out before,
Yeah.
and they were left out of the academy. And I think that a lot of people were invited to the table in different workshops, not in all workshops, but in general, you had people who were left out before. And I think that was just followed something very positive about America, about including different people. And I think that the diversity that when Mezzi is talking about only 60 poets and they all knew each other, let's face it, we all know they were mostly white men.
Yeah.
And I think the workshop helped to democratize the country, but it is also true that it became increasingly, even when I started as a young poet, it wasn't 60, but I could read all the first books. And I could read the second books and sort of knew what was going on. And Garrett was the same. We were really reading everything that was coming out. And now, although people read now, it would be impossible. You actually just could not possibly, with all the presses, and all the stuff online, and all that is good, I think, but it's not possible any longer. There's no center or even an illusion of center anymore that you could have. You couldn't possibly keep up with all the books from your own generation the way we could come close to reading everything there was. But now that's just not in any way possible. And even for Mezzi, when we were coming up, there were too many.
I've got to take off, everybody, because I have urgency.
Okay, that was fast.
Yeah, that was quick.
I think we probably should call it. What do you think, Lucian, Lisa?
I think you have broken the world record of Poetry Junkies. It's the longest ever. It's like a great Akira Kurosawa
You know what
movie.
I'm saying?
You
That
know,
wasn't a compliment. That wasn't
I
a
think
compliment.
Oh,
I
it's been
think it has
wonderful. It's been really
I think
wonderful.
it has been so fabulous, and I am so grateful for every minute you gave us. Thank you, Ed. You are.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
grateful. Wonderful,
you.
wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Love seeing
Good
you.
to see you. Wonderful to hear
Thank
you
you
read.
so much.
Ed,
Good to have so many old and new friends together.
one
Bye.
last
Fantastic.
Oh,
Thanks,
Fantastic.
Lucian. Thanks, Lisa.
Oh,
Ed,
you're welcome.
you could respond with one last thing, because let's face it, we're in a very historically challenging time, and in a dark time the eye begins to see, as Ritka said. Give us a final yes to end. When I say yes, I mean, I'm referring a bit to Wallace Stevens. After the final no, there comes a yes. And on this yes, the future world depends. Just give us a quick last yes, Ed. Thank you.
well, I mean, you've just given it to us, but I do think that poetry is a way of paying it forward, and that the premise of poetry is hopeful. And I believe that. And the reason I believe that is no matter how lonely the poem or how isolated the poem, the fact that someone would write it as a poem suggests that someone could read it. And that even when, say, John Clare writes, I am, yet what I am none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. Even when he says he's in a mental hospital, he says he's the self-consumer of his woes. He is putting in an iambic pentameter and making it rhyme and describing it for some future reader or listener. To me, that's hopeful. It means that he's reaching out and believes that human communication is still possible, even though it's not possible to the people around him. And so I really do believe that the premise, the heart of poetry, no matter how despairing the individual lyric, the very premise of poetry is hopeful, because it believes that we can take our own alienations and convert them into something beautiful that can communicate to people in the future. So I do believe there's a kind of human solidarity at the heart of the poetic enterprise that is encouraging, because it believes finally that we can overcome our own solipsism and find community with others.